Good evening and welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure. Welcome Instagram people and our friends on Facebook Live as well. We have an amazing amount of information to share this evening. Stuff that is so important to us as Jewish people. And really we're going to talk about the birth of the Jewish people, but we're going to start at a very, dare I say it, unusual point. The discussion this evening is what I like to call the greatest journey of Jewish history. The greatest journey of Jewish history. Because there have been, in Jewish history, it's fair to say, two of the greatest journeys, just allowing our Zoom friends to join us. I'm so sorry. Two of the greatest journeys the Jewish people have made that have changed world history are not only individually important, but actually depend and reflect upon each other. The first great journey of Jewish history is the journey of Abraham. Abraham leaving Ur Kasdim, modern day Iraq. It was Mesopotamia in its day. Leaving, going to Haran, and eventually ending his journey in the land of Israel. That's journey number one. Journey number two, which we won't be discussing in detail today, but we will in the future. But I want to plant it in your minds because it is very reflective and representative of the first journey. And that is the journey of the Jewish people leaving Egypt under the leadership of Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, and making their way into the land of Israel. Both are important, but the second journey would never have happened without the first one. So with your permission, I'd like to look and examine at the words that the Torah uses to describe this journey that Abraham and his wife Sarah made, which really got the ball rolling in terms of creating the Jewish people and really all of Jewish history. But not just the Jewish people were impacted by this journey. The entire world and everyone in it throughout world history has somehow been affected by what happened to Abraham and Sarah, their family, the events, the trials and tribulations they went through at this time. And it happens to coincide with our Torah portion. Let me read the words of the Torah, the Bible, to you. And we're in the book of Genesis, chapter 12, verse 1. And the Torah tells us that God spoke to Abraham. Vayom Hashem el Avram. At this point, he wasn't Abraham. He wasn't Avraham. He was Avram. The Hey was not added to his name yet. Abraham had to go through a number of changes, personal life changes, and make a number of life choices before the letter Hey was added to his name. At this point is Avram. Now, Avram means he was the Av of Aram. He was the father of the area called Aram, which was where he was living at this time. However, later on, after this journey takes place, the letter He was added and his name changed, reflecting his soul mission changing as well. And he became Abraham, Haman, the father of a multitude of nations. Millions, if not billions of people are going to look, which they do to this day, and say, Abraham, because of this journey, this great journey that you took from the land of Ur Kasdim and Haran, Mesopotamia, Iraq, into Israel, you become Avamon. You became our spiritual and, in some cases, genealogical ancestor as well. And that is the journey. Whether you see him as Avraham Avinu, as Abraham, as Ibrahim, you cannot deny the major impact that this man and his wife and family, and of course his descendants, had upon the world. And so he was told to lech. Lech. Lech means go. Anyone who's driven in Israel, has had to deal with the traffic and the crazy driving, has heard that word, and sometimes if they're unlucky, words attached to it as well. If you're ever in traffic holding things up, lech means go. But that wasn't what he was told to do. He was told to lech lecha, Now the second word is the same letters as the first word, but a change of vowels. Lech means just to go. Take a physical journey, leave point A, go to point B, but that's not what Abraham was going through. Abraham was told, and this is a message to all of us, sometimes in your life, you have to get out of your comfort zone and you have to lech lecha. Lecha means for you, for your benefit. This journey you're about to take, says God, is going to change you and the impact that you start to have outside of Israel, and it's about to become multiplied many, many times once you arrive in Israel and even when you leave again. That is the lech and the lecha. Go for your benefit. You're comfortable now. You're doing amazing. And he was comfortable. Financially, him and his wife were extreme. The Torah goes out of its way to tell us how wealthy Abraham and Sarah were. But they were also spiritually successful. They were impacting thousands upon thousands of people and leading them away from idol worship, which in those days, for the most part, involved killing children and doing other terrible, terrible things, child sacrifice, and says, no, we don't die for God, we live for God. And he brought them under the wings of God's presence, the Shekhinah, and made them into monotheists. He was doing well financially, he was doing well spiritually, and yet God said, this is not your end. You're 75 years old, life is just beginning. In other nations, you hit 60, 65, 70, 75, you're retired, you're done. In Judaism, you're just getting going. Moses was 80 years old when he received his message to go in and take the Jewish people out of Egypt. For us, whenever the rest of the world is like, we're done, put me in the home, I'm over, the Jewish people say, no, life gets going. That's when you really start to see the impact, the fruits of your labors finally coming into fruition. So the words lech lecha mean go for you for your benefit. You're going to benefit from this journey, but the word lecha means something else, and it works in terms of the grammar as well. Lech lecha can also mean go to you. You're going to find yourself. You're going to see things inside you which you never knew existed. Parts of your personality, they're going to be revealed to you and your wife through the tests that I'm about to give you that you never thought you would ever be able to overcome. Because Abraham, says the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, was tested with 10 trials. And this test was the first of the 10. According to most opinions, some disagree with the exact order, but according to most, this was the first of the 10 tests. Why was it a test? Go to Israel. Sounds amazing. The journey, the effort, the impact, leaving everything behind, extremely difficult. Look at the words of the Bible, of the Torah, when it describes this. Where it says, Lech lecha, go, find yourself. We even say anything, find yourself. This is the Hebrew, the Torah way of saying, go find yourself. Someone once said beautifully, ships are very safe in the harbor, but that's not what they're meant for. They're meant to travel. And Abraham was comfortable and he was doing extremely well, but he had to move and create a whole new reality. And he was told to go. Listen to the beautiful wording of the Torah. Mi artzacha, leave your land. Mi moladtecha, and your birthplace, your relatives. Mi beit avicha, and your father's house. Leave your land, your community, your close relatives, and your father's house. Now, if this was just a geographical statement, it's the wrong order. You don't leave your land, then your local community, and then your father's house. First of all, if you want to travel abroad, first of all, you leave your father's house, you leave your local community, your family, your relatives, people around you grew up with, and then you leave your country. Says the Ramban Nachmanides, obviously this isn't a statement of geographical relocation. This is not lech, it's lech lecha. This journey is going to change you, and through this journey, you're going to change the entire world, including, of course, the birth of your son Isaac and his son Jacob, which would eventually become the entire Jewish people. This is back to front. Why? Because this is a statement of ascending difficulty, leaving your country, the nation you grew up with, and all the customs and mores and and society you grew up in, that impacted you negatively, you're going to have to leave that behind. You know what's harder than that? To leave your local community. Because what those people pushed upon you your entire life is going to be a harder challenge to cut yourself away from that. But you know what's even harder than that? To leave your father's house, your parents, everything they taught you, and your siblings, and your immediate nuclear family. That's going to be the hardest at all. This goes to show how difficult this test was. My friends, why would Abraham want to leave his father's house? Didn't Abraham grow up in a beautiful, warm, nurturing, spiritual, financial environment? No, he didn't. And don't let anyone else tell you differently. The Haggadah of Pesach tells us very clearly, and the Midrash does too, that Abraham came from very humble beginnings. His father wasn't some great spiritual leader. His father was an idol worshipper. An actual idol worshipper. Not only that, he wasn't only an idol worshipper. He worked in an idol worship shop. Not only did he work in it, he owned it. Abraham's father had the Costco of idols. And Abraham, we're told, from a very young age, did not understand. It didn't make sense to him. From the age of 3 years old, we're told that Abraham started to question and wonder. And this stayed with him for years and years, until the age of 40, when he actually concretized these ideas in his head. And he says, I don't understand. How can it be this beautiful world just came around through a bunch of idols? There's a spiritual power. There's a unifying force that brings everything together. What makes the planet spin and the universe? It doesn't make sense. The Midrash tells us that Abraham was like a man walking through a forest. And everything is jumbled and nothing makes sense. And then he sees a beautiful palace, which is all lit up. And he thinks to himself, could it be this palace just made it here by itself? And just randomly got together with brick upon brick, such beautiful designs, and the whole thing's lit up. Someone lit the fire. So too, Abraham looked at the world, was able to penetrate, and he was a regular person. He's not some supernatural being. He was a normal individual who grew up, had challenges, difficulties with his parents, difficulties getting married, and challenges of having kids. He was a regular of making a living. He was a regular person. Our ancestors, our spiritual heroes, weren't all born into great power and spiritual leadership. They're born into challenge and difficulty. And Abraham is no exception. We think of Abraham as being the son of a great... He wasn't. And one day Abraham walked into his father's store, and his father said, I have to go somewhere. Could you watch the idol shop for me? And he says, sure, father, of course I can. And while his father had gone, he took a big hammer and smashed the idols into smithereens. But he left the biggest idol there, and he jammed the axe into the hand of the biggest idol. And his father came back and said, what the heck? I put you in charge of my business, and you ruined the entire thing. It's all destroyed. Not the first Jewish boy to destroy their family's business. But this was for a good reason. And he destroyed the entire thing. His father said, what happened to him? He says, the idol wasn't me, Abba. The idol did it. His father said, what are you talking about? Idols are just stupid pieces of clay that are lumped together. They can't have this power. And Abraham said, let your ears hear what your mouth said. How could it be? Seemed like a simple story. There's a tremendous amount of depth in that story that speaks a lot about the relationship between Abraham and his father, as well as their personalities. But even on a surface level, Abraham persuaded his father and actually brought his father back. Don't underestimate the power of children to turn back their parents from something they've been doing their entire lives. There is a tremendous power that we invest in our kids, which could actually rebound and influence and impact us in a positive way. Side point, but that's precisely, my friends, what happened to Abraham Avinu. He managed to change his father. And so his father came with him, at least on part of the journey, and went with him. Now, one of the difficulties for Abraham for this journey was not only leaving behind his money and wealth, and wasn't even leaving behind all the spiritual good that he has done, but leaving behind his students. Because we know that Abraham impacted thousands and thousands of people. and he brought them back to God, and he persuaded them not to get involved in idol worship and not to kill their children in sacrifice. He said, God doesn't want you to die. God wants you to live. Living for God is so much more important and difficult than dying for God. Leave that behind. And he did that using a special mechanism of chesed, of bringing them close, of feeding them, talking to them. He wrote books and he discussed and he argued and he traveled from city to city. You know, Abraham was extremely wealthy. And there were houses that he could have built himself a very beautiful house. What was he in the, the copper, steel days? I don't know what it was, but he could have built himself a big, beautiful home. Instead, him and his wife, Sarah, lived in a tent. In a tent! That's it! Not everyone was living in tents. Everyone knew how to build rudimentary homes. Why? Because if you live in a stone house, you're stuck in one location. But Abraham took upon himself and said, if I'm going to impact the world, I need to journey. And the journey of Abraham, by the way, is going to be mirrored by his descendants, us, the Jewish people, as we're going to journey around the world and impact the world as well. And so Abraham and his wife Sarah made it a point of having tents. Yes, he was an intense person. Excuse the pun, excuse the joke, I'll be here all night, enjoy the chicken. But he spent his entire life journeying and traveling, saying, I'm going to make the world into a better place, and stuck in one location won't let me do that. So instead, I'm going to travel. And he went from town to town and city to city, and he impacted tens of thousands of people just by being in that tent, and influence them in the way of God and pulling them away from idol worship and bring them into ethical monotheism. You see, Abraham is compared in a number of ways to Noah. Noah, him of the ark and the animals, was a great person, but he only managed to influence and impact himself, his family, and the animals. But the rest of humanity didn't manage to do. They died out. Abraham turned it around. And that's why Abraham is considered the father of the Jewish people. Abraham was not the first monotheist. He wasn't the first person to believe in God. Noah believed in God. Methuselah believed in God. Adam, Eve, Cain, Hevel, they all believed in God. What makes Abraham different? And the answer is he did something about his belief. He went out of his comfort zone and he traveled and he brought people under God's Kanfei Shechina, under the wings of God's presence. And that is the power that Abraham had. And God said, you did it so well, we need you to do it elsewhere. And I know that's a challenge. By the way, what happened to all these students of Abraham? Where did they go? They didn't become the Jewish people, because becoming the Jewish people was exclusively for the children of Abraham through his son Isaac and son Jacob, who had the 12 tribes. So where do these people go to? It's very interesting. There's different opinions. One opinion was once Abraham left and made his journey, they kind of departed and went back to their idol worshipping ways, because without a spiritual leader that you have with you all the time, someone you turn to for questions and advice, you're going to revert back to your ways. That for us, we translate in modern Hebrew as, or even ancient Hebrew, Asela Harav. Everyone needs a spiritual guide. No matter how great you've become, you need to connect yourself to great spiritual people. So that's one idea. Others disagree and say they didn't go back to their previous idol worship ways. They went back to their homes and they ended up spreading monotheism to tens of thousands of people who lived around them. Which is why to this day, we see the idea of monotheism, one God. Idol worship has pretty much gone away, pretty much. And so these people impacted others using what they learned from Abraham and his amazing wife, Sarah. There's a third opinion, which is a Kabbalistic idea, which I must share with you. And they say that these souls that Abraham made, that's how they're described, the souls that they made and took with them, these souls of people died out in that generation for whatever reason, because there was no Jewish people at that point for them to connect to and to join. This was Abraham's journey and not theirs. But in the future, many years later, there would be a Jewish people who would become Jewish at Mount Sinai. And these souls would end up reincarnating. I told you it was a Kabbalistic idea. And they would be converts of the future. So when the Jewish people to this day have converts join them, These aren't just random individuals who like wake up one morning, hello, right? I'll become Jewish and, not eat pig anymore, right? I've met many great converts. Two of my closest rabbis and advisors are converts as well. One of my great teachers at college was a convert. He was a very, very holy and very learned individual. These are souls that were originally made by Abraham and Sarah that reincarnated throughout history and were placed throughout the world. And according to this idea, this is going to sound crazy to you, but one of the reasons that the Jewish people were spread around the world in Galut, in exile, was so that these individuals through history would be able to pick up and see the Jewish community living in their town, whether it's in China somewhere or in France or in England or Russia, and say like, this speaks to me. I want to become part of your people. Me personally, as an outreach rabbi with many videos online, weekly, I'm not just today, I'll send it if you want to see it. I received a WhatsApp message, don't ask how I got my number, from a Muslim individual living in modern day Iran who said, I watch your videos, I read many books, I visit websites, I want to convert to Judaism. Can you show me the way to get there? I used Google Translate in order to communicate with this individual. These, if it ends up happening, are holy souls of individual that started at the time of Abraham and this journey that he took. Because this journey changed everything. You can't impact the world staying in one place. As I said before, ships are very safe in the harbor. But my friends, that's not what they're made for. Ships are there to go out and venture. And that's what Abraham did together with his wife Sarah. And he created a movement that has impacted the world to this very point. One of the expressions we use for Abraham, which we don't use too much nowadays, is a Hebrew. Hebrew, a language, but Hebrew refers to what Abraham was. He was Ivri. Ivri. What does the word Ivri mean? What does the word Hebrew mean in Hebrew? Ivri. So the word Ivri, says Rashi, comes from the word la'avor, to pass. He was on one side of the river and everyone else was on the other side. What does that mean? Is that a geographical statement? The Torah doesn't make irrelevant geographical statements. Say the commentators. Ivri, Hebrew, is actually a characteristic of Abraham and will be of his descendants. And that is, he's on the opposite side. The world is saying one thing, and the people who connect to Abraham are on the other side and say, that's not what we do. The world was involved in paganism and idol worship. Everyone. And Abraham, from a young age, was able to turn around to them and say, that's not right. And that's a very dangerous game to play, because there was a man who lived in those days of Abraham by the name of Nimrod. And he was an Ishkabah, a very strong man. Doesn't mean he was physically strong. That means he was a dictator. He had created his own movement. And one thing dictators don't like is revolutionaries. And so he took Abraham and he attempted to kill him. And miraculously, Abraham survived this fiery furnace that he was thrown into, and he survived. And from that time onwards, Abraham was known as the person who his descendants were going to represent as well as Akshanim. The world says one thing, and we, the Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham, are and always will be the counterculture. The world says it. That's why you see Jewish people starting organizations and companies and fighting, and not always for the right? Many times they are incorrect, right? But they're always fighting, trying to improve the world, trying to fight against the power that is. This power goes back to the time of Abraham. Now, it has to be channeled in the right way, which it isn't always. But that is the Jewish people. We are the Akshanim, with the Kashei Oref. We're the stiff-necked people that if you try to take us off course, it takes a lot of work. But trying to bring them back is a lot of work as well. We're the stubborn nation, the countercultural, and that is Abraham. The power that was given to Abraham, the Torah tells us, is something unbelievable. Most people are not aware of this. You see, up to this point in history, besides the fact that no one really was spreading ethical monotheism, because of this journey that Abraham was able to take, something changed in the world. See, up to that point, God was the only being that was able to give blessings, to give brachot. But the Torah tells us this changed. And it says, those who you bless will be blessed, and those curse, curse. And through you, you, Abraham, and your descendants, if they're worthy and fitting to do this and live up to this ability, it takes effort, are now going to have the ability to bless as well. It used to be just me, says God, who gave blessings to the world. Now you and your descendants are going to have the power and the ability to bless as well. And that's going to come as a result of this incredible journey, this movement away from everything you've known, leaving behind the challenges, the difficulties, and the accomplishments that you managed to create as you make your way to Israel. And you know what's amazing about this journey? If I told you to go somewhere, would you just go? Even if it's God, right? Even if you saw me as a God, you're like, sure, where am I going? And I'm like, I'm not going to tell you. You're like, what do you mean you're not going to tell me? I'm like, just go. Lech lecha. Where to? To the land that I'm going to show you. It's exactly what the Torah says. The Torah says you should go el haaretz asher areka, to the land that I am going to show you. Now we know where the land was going to be. Canaan, the future country that will be called the land of Israel. Why doesn't God just tell him that's where you're going? God knows where he's going. Abraham was going to end up there anyway, so why not just tell him? And from here we learned an even more important lesson. And it goes like this, listen very carefully. A journey isn't always about the destination, it's about the journey itself. The journey is the thing. The travel, the movement that we take, whether it's geographical or spiritual or emotional, am I going to end up in that place? I want to start learning. I want to become a greater person in terms of my midot. I want to be able to finish the Torah. I want to start learning a new book, whatever it is. Am I going to finish it? Maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe the destination of whether you're going to finish it is not the real question. The question is, are you going to leave on the journey? The test isn't whether you arrive. That's in the hands of God. The test is, are you willing to throw yourself out? Just like the Jewish people over 1,000 years later, who were able to leave Egypt, throw themselves into a desert and make their journey to the land of Israel. The two mirror each other. The Hebrew expression is Masa Avot, Siman Labanim. The actions of our forefathers is a sign, a portent to their descendants. The only reason the Jewish people left Egypt, made their way into the Sinai desert, received the Torah, and went into Israel 40 years later, is because Abraham and his wife uprooted themselves and made this journey to the land of Israel. Without this one, we would not be who we are, and the world would not be as it is. This one person, a regular individual of flesh and blood, who came from a pretty bad family of idol worshippers, not some great spiritual yichus background, was able to formulate a whole new reality that we're still feeling the reverberations of to this very day. You know the proof that this journey was not about the destination? Because when he gets there, there's a famine and he has to leave and make his way down to Egypt. What would you be like? Like, are you kidding me? You told me to come here, I got here, and this is what greets me? That's what most of us would say. And what does Abraham do? No problem. It was never about the destination. It was always about the journey. So I arrive in Israel, and now I got to go somewhere else, because that's part of the journey as well. And much of life is like that. We are tested, and we get through something, and we get to the next phase, and we're like, now I can sit and relax. And then turmoil awaits you. You're like, what the heck's this? I went through the challenge, God. Tell me another one. The answer is, it was always there. This is still part of the original challenge, because life is a test. And Abraham was tested with 10 tests. This being the first, we said. Says the Nesiv Shalom, one of the great deep Hasidic masters, so too, every Jew is tested with 10 trials. that they need to overcome in order to find their own personal greatness. And so Abraham traveled from Mesopotamia, from Ur Kasdim to Haran, to the land of Israel, and then off to Egypt, then back to Israel again. That's okay. It's all one long test that made Abraham great. That, my friends, is the power of Abraham, leaving behind everything that was and becoming something much greater. I want to talk about another challenge, another part of the journey that happened to Abraham at this time, and eventually is going to revisit us at the end of days. Because remember, Maseh Avot, Siman Labanim, whatever happened to our forefathers is going to happen to us as well. Abraham and his wife, more so his wife, was tested by not having children. Now, this test of being barren, not having children, wasn't exclusive to Abraham and Sarah. Isaac and Rebekah, their children had to deal with it. And Yaakov, Jacob, and his wife Rachel, Rachel, had to deal with it. It cannot be a coincidence that Hannah, one of the great Jewish heroines of Jewish history, it can't be a coincidence that some of the greatest Jewish heroines of Jewish history had to deal with barrenness. In order to understand this, you have to understand why have children anyway, because that itself is a very big and expensive journey. These people didn't want children just so they could dress them up, push them around in their bugaboo and wave to their friends, right? And put little booties on their feet. That's a benefit. But that's not the reason. The reason is because they wanted to build up the Jewish nation. They knew that something great was going to come from them. They knew that in order to make the world great, they would have to create generations of people who would continue their work and their efforts. Because sometimes change comes in one day, sometimes a week, sometimes a month, sometimes a generation, sometimes in the case of Abraham and his students, millennia potentially. And so Abraham and Sarah were greatly pained, but Sarah says, look, this is what God wants from me. Here I am, 90 years old. By the way, Abraham was 75 in this journey, and she was 65. As I mentioned before, their lives just got going, right? When they were 75 and 65. There's no retiring for us. We begin our journey at old age, right? We don't retire, we just go. And so, Sarah realizes, I'm too old to naturally have kids. We don't pray for miracles in Judaism. That's an anathema for us. God gives what he wants to give us. We pray, but never for the miraculous. And so she saw that Abraham had a very holy maidservant who she allowed to be together with him in order to have a child. And that child was meant to actually become a son. This is the first case of surrogacy. This child would enter and become part of the Jewish people. Unfortunately, when the child was born, Hagar started to mock Sarah, saying, you've tried for decades. I got pregnant immediately. She looked down upon it, and the deal changed last minute. Very, very painful for Sarah. Eventually, they realized that this child was not meant to be with them right now. And Sarah removed this child, Yishmael, and his mother, Hagar, from their home. And they gave him resources and told him to leave. Abraham didn't want to. Sarah realized the negative impact that this boy was going to have on her son and her family, and therefore she eventually kicked him out. This is a proof, by the way, says Rashi, that the level of prophecy of Sarah was greater than Abraham. We look at Abraham, the great prophet, the great leader. Sarah, according to us, was greater than Abraham. God says, listen to your wife. She knows what's best. That journey that Yishmael took is going to revisit us at the end of days, because from Yishmael comes the Arab nations. And Yishmael did teshuvah, repentance, at the end of his life. We know that because he was involved with Isaac, his brother, through their father Abraham, burying Abraham. So to the end of days, say the great holy rabbis, you can read more about this in my book, the Yishmaelim, the Arab nations, were to come back and reunite with the Jewish people. My friends, I mention it because we're seeing this today. We're seeing the reunification after a long time and a lot of struggle between Jews and Arabs. In our day of shalom between us, the Jewish peoples en masse moved to the land of Israel, surrounded by hostile Arab nations, and slowly we're seeing it. The beginning of the messianic drama is starting to unfold before our very eyes. It happens right here. You're not going to understand what's happening in the Middle East today and the relationship between the Jews, Arabs, and all the other nations unless you study the Torah and see how this one journey of Abraham and all the events that surround it are impacting us for thousands of years. We're seeing the final culmination of this journey of the return of the Jewish people and our generation back home to the land of Israel. It's all come full circle. We're returning back to where we're meant to be. The journey we're all taking, the spiritual, the emotional, the religious, and sometimes geographical journey is all there to bring us back to our true selves. Because we are being told, Lech Lecha, go to you, find yourself. You have teachers, you have leaders, find the right one and return back to your true, amazing self. We'll stop over there. The secret of the greatest journey in Jewish history. I wish you all a fantastic week and a Shabbat Shalom. If you want to, you can join me tomorrow, 12 o'clock, same channel. We'll be discussing the parenting methods of Abraham and Sarah and 5 great parenting lessons that Abraham and Sarah taught us. That'll be tomorrow, 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Well, Abba.
Yeah, Sadiq.
When's Eastern time?